A 16-year-old boy in South India suddenly becomes convinced that he's about to die. No illness and absolutely no warning. This boy lies down on the floor, his body stiff like a corpse, a dead body, and realizes that even when his body has zero agency or control, and awareness remains. And when he gets up a few minutes later, there's a permanent and very fundamental change that comes over him. The fear of death is gone. The ordinary sense of being a separate person begins to dissolve. And within months, he abandons his family and spends a lot of time sitting silently in temples. He barely speaks, he barely reacts to the world, and he eventually becomes one of the most influential spiritual figures of the 20th century. This was Ramana Maharshi, and whatever happened to him at 16 was not the same thing that happened to the Buddha. Because the Buddha spent 6 years intentionally searching for awakening, and for Ramana, it happened without searching or any intention at all on his part. In this video, we are going to apply a different lens, a psychological and somewhat neuroscientific lens to the Buddha and Ramana Maharshi. Now, disclaimer, this is a fun video and a guess. Now, the Buddha looks like a very analytical investigator of suffering, while Ramana looks like somebody whose sense of self broke down spontaneously and never really recovered itself in the ordinary way. Did they arrive at the same destination, the same truth? Maybe, but they have completely different paths and completely different philosophies to arrive at the destination, and a lot of that has to do with their circumstances and probably their temperaments. So what actually happened to Ramana? Because most people tell the story in one sentence. He had a death experience and he became enlightened. But that's not really an explanation. Based on what we now know about the brain, I'd say when the death terror struck him, the amygdala, the brain's threat detection system, can undergo very radical long-term changes, especially in cases where there's extreme shock or near-death states involved. At the same time, what is known as the default mode network in neuroscience, the system associated with autobiographical identity, basically the ego, the constant narration of me, may have broken down very dramatically. So thoughts still arise, feelings and emotions still occur, but they are no longer organized around a central psychological owner. And interestingly, Ramana is not the only reported case of something like this happening suddenly. Eckhart Tolle, also a very famous non-duality teacher, described a spontaneous collapse of the ordinary self. And he had this very unbearable, depressive experience one night. He recalls thinking, I can't live with myself anymore. And then suddenly realizing, who is the I that can't live with the self? And then something changed. This temporary form of ego dissolution also appears in near-death experiences. They happen quite often in advanced meditation and certain seizure-related attacks. Now, these states are not the strange part. What's strange about Ramana is that the non-dual state that he accessed during his near-death experience stabilized permanently. It didn't ruin him psychologically, it became his baseline. And that's important because most people who undergo sudden destabilization of selfhood do not become peaceful and happy sages. They panic, they dissociate, and Ramana did not. Why? Probably because of the kind of psyche he already had. He probably had very low neuroticism to begin with and very low investment in identity. And so the ego breakdown had almost nothing to collide with. And that's probably why it can't be imitated. So he was a godman in the purest sense, because the nature of the awakening found a psyche that was very receptive, almost like he was touched by God. Now compare this to the Buddha. Awakening didn't happen out of the blue for the Buddha. He actively went seeking it for 6 years. He leaves his palace at around age 29. He studies under renowned meditation teachers. He masters deep states of concentration. And there was a phase where he pushed his body to the extreme. He would eat only a grain of rice the entire day. According to the texts, he becomes so emaciated that he could feel his spine through his stomach. Eventually, he realizes that neither luxury nor self-torture solves the problem. So he sits beneath the Bodhi tree and he makes an extraordinary decision. I'm not getting up until I understand suffering completely. What follows is not spontaneous collapse. It's systematic investigation. Layer after layer of concentration and insight is unraveled. The Buddha approaches suffering almost like a detective, like a scientist. Not who am I, but how does suffering even happen? That difference matters a lot. Ramana's awakening feels like the sudden dissolution of the ego. The Buddha's awakening feels like the deliberate deconstruction of the mind, of his psychology. And this is where the Buddha becomes surprisingly modern because he learned, quite painfully, that insight can destabilize people. So there's a very disturbing story in the early Buddhist texts. The Buddha taught a practice where his followers could contemplate dead bodies. It was meant to break attachment to the body. It was so intense that several monks began to feel severe repulsion towards their own bodies. Some ended their lives. This happened while the Buddha was away. So when the Buddha returned and discovered what had happened, he stopped the practice and he replaced it with gentler breath meditation. The tradition itself treats this as a mistake. It is a mistake, and the lesson is profound. Insight without emotional grounding can become very dangerous. That's why the Buddha built structure into the path. Ethics first, then the development of concentration or attention, and then gradual training to achieve awakening. Ramana, by contrast, offered much less structure and preparation. And that makes sense because Ramana did not gradually walk a path. He seems to have begun at the endpoint, the destination. Trying to imitate that too literally can become dangerous and maybe not even possible because most people do not undergo a spontaneous ego breakdown and then stabilize peacefully afterward. And this difference becomes even more important. Ramana's tradition, which is Advaita Vedanta, says there is a fundamental awareness underneath the personality structure. The ego is a misidentification. The practice is self inquiry. Now, to be clear, Ramana did not reject meditation or spiritual practice altogether. He often spoke about silence, devotion, concentration, meditation. But compared to the Buddha, his approach was one central thing, which is trace the I thought back to its source. For Ramana, ordinary meditation could quiet the mind in a temporary way. But self inquiry targeted the root structure, producing the sense of separateness itself. In this regard, the Buddha's position is even more radical. The Buddha's doctrine of anatta, non self, does not say that there's a deeper, eternal self underneath experience. It says the ego itself is a process, a construction. Thoughts arise, sensations arise, perceptions arise, but there is no permanent entity underneath all of them. So Ramana says that there is a fundamental awareness beneath the ego. Buddha says even the sense of a discoverer is constructed. Even if they're essentially saying the same thing, the philosophy and the path to arrive at this destination changes completely. The Buddha and Ramana also feel fundamentally different in terms of temperament. The early Buddhist texts describe someone with immense attentional control and a mind that was allergic to half answers. The Buddha feels like an analyst, somebody who diagnoses, somebody who sees suffering and immediately wants to understand it, map it, and make a system around how to get out of it. Ramana is obviously different in this regard. He's less like a builder of systems and more like someone for whom the entire psychological structure did not matter at all. And it's clear why. He didn't have much of an individual psychology. He was always merged in the self. And the one event that transformed him happened to him at the age of 16, which I think is another important factor. You're not fully developed psychologically, your frontal lobes are not developed, you can't fully imagine future consequences, and your brain is a lot weaker in terms of concept making in comparison to someone who's 30 or 35. Now, if I had to summarize this, right, if the Buddha is a surgeon, Ramana is somebody who never had to pick up the knife. And I think this is the real takeaway. The Buddha and Ramana are versions of the same story. Both left the same teaching that much of what we experience as me may be far less stable and far less necessary than we think.